But for our purposes, this is when we talk about the Viking Age, this is what we're talking about in terms of chronology. And cartography, where are we in the world? So if we think about Scandinavia, as I mentioned, this kind of heartland, this focus of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, what we identify as Scandinavia today. But eventually, the Viking Age, of course, it's about expansion. So there's movement across the North Sea into the British Isles, Northern Europe, Normandy, for example, the river systems of Russia, which I'll talk about a little bit more, down into the Black Sea, of course. And then colonization, settlement of the North Atlantic. So Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland, or Vinland, as we called it then. So you'll see this map several times during the course of my talk today, but just to get us familiar with the geography and where we're looking when we talk about these places. And if we think about the material culture of what really is indicative of the Vikings, we think maybe about the grave goods. This is where we're most familiar with some of the artifacts. So these are brooches, for example, that are from an excavation in Jorvik in England, which was a Viking settlement. And they're made of bronze. They're made of some sort of like a plated, you can see a brass or a bronze plate, and some of copper and silver. And this is really what they look like. These are replicas, of course, but they were worn, women wore them, men wore them as well, and also decorated as grave goods, we see. So that's indicative of the Viking Age. There's very indicative styles and artistic decoration on them. We also have these lovely little chess pieces. These are the Lewis chessmen. These were found in the Outer Hebrides, made of ivory, and may give us an idea of those possible Viking helmets, Viking swords, and Viking shields. And these are kind of the angry Viking portrayal here with gritted teeth. But these are now in the British Museum. And one of the major finds, you could say, are forms of material culture that's really indicative of the Viking Age are the finds or the hoards that are a combination of a silver or sometimes gold, but mainly silver, that are in the forms of hoards that have been buried and left behind. And these are quite, you'd say, common in a sense throughout Scandinavia. And they're a combination of the necklaces and the bracelets you can see there. If you can, I'll make a little note here, but this is, of course, one of the torque type necklaces. We also have the bracelets. There's some types of bowls, kind of, they almost look like Greek omphale. These are a very common finds, but what also we find in these are coins that are, some are from Scandinavia, some are from the British Isles, but overwhelming majority of them are coming from the caliphates of the Middle East. So from at this point in time, the Abbasid Caliphate and smaller caliphates of Central Asia. And one of the things to think about when we talk about material culture is what's called hack silver. And so what's happening is the silver itself, the coins that are coming out of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, they're not so much of interest for themselves, but it's pure silver. It's almost pure silver. So this is the value that people are putting on the goods. And they cut up the silver, and it's called, the hack comes from, and melt it down for its weight and reshape it into these necklaces. And so a majority of the silver and the jewelry that we find in hoards in Scandinavia are actually originating from these coins from the Abbasid Caliphate and other sources outside of Scandinavia. So that's that term, hack silver, if I mention it again, where it comes from. And also, longhouses are very typical of this period. They're not so well preserved because they were made out of wood, but the foundations and the impressions within sediments are preserved. And this is an example of reconstruction of a longhouse up in northern Norway in the Lofoten Islands. And it has this long, lovely shape. It almost looks like an overturned boat. And inside, people lived alongside animals. Kind of benches formed along sides of these longhouses. And there's quite a few that are really well known, also from northern Germany as well. And the last bit of material culture that we'll focus on today is the clinker-built ships, but we'll definitely get back to that later in this talk. I do want to touch upon, before we go any further, something that is helpful to think about when we think about Viking contacts with other cultural groups. And that's this, what happens during the Viking Age is the conversion from paganism to Christianity. And here is this is a church painting of the monk Ansgar. He's going and proselytizing throughout Scandinavia, which he began doing in the middle of the 9th century. He had permission from the Pope, and he was, Ansgar was eventually the Bishop of Hamburg. But he got permission to go and try and convert the pagan Scandinavians, and at sites like Birka in Sweden or Ribe in Denmark, which I'll talk about in a minute. Churches were built after his visits and his conversion process. And we really start to see a major change of paganism, so focusing on this plurality of gods like Odin or Thor, to focusing on monotheism of Christianity in about the 10th century. And one of the major sites in Denmark is the site called Jelling, which is in Jutland. And it's, I hope you can see it here, it's 2 pagan grave mounds of earlier rulers. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily known who they are. But in the middle of these 2 pagan burial mounds was built a Christian church by Harold Bluetooth. And this was done in the middle of the 10th century. This is a plan view of it. And this is really what in Scandinavia is pointed to as kind of the conversion to Christianity, the baptism. And out front of this church are 2 rune stones with inscriptions in runic by Harold Bluetooth, the king, who notes that he won the whole of Denmark. He consolidated Denmark and Norway, and he turned the Danes to Christianity. So he converted, and it's questionable whether he forcibly converted the Danes and the Norwegians, or they were willingly converted to Christianity around about 980 AD. And this is the backside of that stone, and it's actually thought to be the first representation in Scandinavia of Christ being crucified. So this is the baptism stone of the Danes, as it's called. So if we think about the emergence of trade networks during this period, the how and the why, these are one of the characteristics of the Viking Age, these trade networks. And they really start to emerge from the heartland, focused on Scandinavia of present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, in about the 8th century. And these are seen mainly in the establishment of trading towns or craft towns or port towns. So the 4 I'm pointing out here are Birka, what is now Sweden, Kaupang in southern Norway, Ribe in western Denmark, and then Helgo, which is in northern Germany, present northern Germany. And these 4 sites really began to emerge in the early 8th century. Some lasted only to the end of the Viking Age. Ribe was still occupied in the medieval period and is currently still occupied. But these settlements are unusual because it's a change from the Iron Age beforehand, the period beforehand, migration period into the Viking Age, where populations are coming together and larger numbers of people are coalescing. They're growing in number, but not only that, they're living close together, they're building houses close together, and they start specializing in trade. So what's happening is trade goods are coming in, raw goods are coming in, And within these settlements, these craft towns, people are specializing in converting raw materials into finished goods. So we see metal smithies, for example, creating these brooches that I talked about, converting the silver that's being starting to come into these regions. Deer antler is a major product that's being converted into combs or small containers, decorative pieces. And also things like eider duck is a very popular traded the down from eider duck. So these centers are coalescing. The crafts are being done and converted, raw goods being converted to finished goods to be sold or traded further. And these 4 sites are important to think about because I'm calling them port towns because they're also all on bodies of water, whether it be a fjord, a bay, an archipelago, or a river. They all are accessible by ships. And this is one of the major changes of these towns, you could say, from the Iron Age period, which preceded it, which these settlements maybe were in the middle of land without access maybe to a navigable body of river, or a body of water like a river. We start to see access for ships to come and right up on the beach, these docks would be built and traders could trade, or the residents there would have their own vessels for trading. And this is a major transition we see at this time in Scandinavia. So from these 4 towns I talked about, ships are able to go north and south, east and west, and it's a huge transition and change, you could say, in mobility. So another major characteristic of the Viking Age is exploration by sailing ships out from the Scandinavian homeland. So the central area I was talking about with Birka, with Kaupang, with Riva, with Helgo. And this really leads to the discovery and settlement of new places in the North Atlantic, but also long distance trade routes in the North Atlantic, but into the Mediterranean, into the Middle East, and into Russia. And here we'll focus especially on a little bit more detail, I should say, of the Russian river system. So we have the Dnieper, we have the Volga, and the Volkhov river systems. And the settlements that start to emerge there, Novgorod, Staraya Lagoga, and Kiev especially, start becoming these eastern river Viking settlements, we refer to as the Rus or the Ros. It's where Russia gets its name from, or these Viking groups that start to emerge along these river systems. And eventually, of course, these river systems are important because they're the connection between the Baltic and the Black Sea, and eventually, of course, places like the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus. If we think about evidence for these trade networks, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the Eastern goods, but we have, of course, the trade goods that come up, the evidence of what's coming in to Scandinavia from at this time. And so I've put some examples here. At the bottom, we have the Skolsholm Horde, which is from Bornholm, Denmark. And it's a really interesting find. It's the largest find of dirhams in Scandinavia from the 9th century. And just to give you an idea of the breadth of finds here, it's about 150 coins, but they range and date from the late Sasanian period, so about I think it's around 600 AD, to the Abbasid Caliph al-Mutakwal from about mid-9th century. And geographically, they spread all the way from Sijil Masa in modern-day Morocco to mints in present-day Uzbekistan in Central Asia. And so all these are coming into Scandinavia. This is just one example of one hoard of dirhams. On the top right is the Allah ring, the inscription there to Allah in Arabic and Kufic script. This was a ring that was found in a woman's grave, along with dirhams mainly from Afghanistan, deposited in Birkas, that trading settlement I talked about. just inland from Stockholm, present-day Stockholm. And this was deposited in the 9th century. So again, we're getting these trade goods, and this is actually the only stone that has a Kufic script on it found so far in Scandinavia. Another example is the Buddha from Helgo, which is near Birka. This was made in the 6th century, probably in the area of Kashmir. It's not sure if it was traveled up to Scandinavia in the 6th century. Stylistically, it's been dated to the 6th century, but it could have been a relic or a later traded good. Just to give you an example of the broad dimensions we're looking at here. Of course, aside from these items, there's also perishables that we don't see in the archaeological record. They're not visible. So items like textiles, especially silk, is something that is known to have been traded from. We have documents that talk about this. Food, for example, getting pepper and getting star anise, getting this kind of fruit juice called dibs made out of dates is coming up from the Gulf regions into Scandinavia. Beads, for example, glass is also being traded northwards. But one thing that's also readily traded that it needs to be recognized are slaves. And this is something that was widely done locally and further abroad. The word Slav is what gives us the word slave today in the English language. And this is something that unfortunately is not necessarily traceable in the archaeological record, but it's something that's known from textual evidence, at least, and discussing the raids that Vikings made to capture slaves and trade them. And so this is an aspect we need to think about when we're thinking about the Viking Age as well. If we think about trade goods, the evidence for trade goods and the evidence for Vikings abroad, we're going to look towards the North Atlantic now, towards the settlements of Iceland and Greenland and Vinland, which is today Newfoundland and Canada. And these settlements start to take place. Movement, maybe population as well, is a little bit pressed in Norway, where these voyages start originating and moving westwards. And they start settling there as well to raise their own livestock. But they also are trading stations, because one of the important goods that they're sending back to Scandinavia and to Europe is walrus ivory. And this is an example of a walrus bone, but if we look at those Lewis chessmen from the Outer Hebrides, again, they're made from walrus ivory, and this was a good that was widely traded back to Northern Europe at the time. And closer to where we all want to be, in Istanbul right now, if we think about evidence for the Vikings abroad, of course, we start thinking about their interactions with other cultural groups. And we can see this especially in the Byzantine period. We think about Hagia Sophia. If we think about up on the southern balcony there, on the southern gallery of Hagia Sophia, there is a runic inscription. You can barely read it. It was discovered in the 1960s, which basically, it's called the Haftan rune inscription. It's a Viking name, Haftan, actually still a name that's used today in Denmark. And it's kind of a Haftan was here type of inscription up on the balcony there of the southern gallery. And this is when Vikings, of course, are coming into Miklago, which means the big city. And so that's what they called Constantinople at the time. It's been suggested that this inscription is from a member of the Varangian Guard. This is not possible to know, of course, but they were present in Constantinople at this time, and I'll discuss that in a minute. If we look also at maybe evidence of Vikings abroad, there's I think about 30 ships, graffitis of ships within Hagia Sophia. And this one has been proposed as a Viking ship. It's on one of the columns up in the southern gallery. This is possibly, if we can think about this being a ship, maybe it has kind of a dragon's headed prow, similar to what we've seen in Scandinavia. This is a reconstruction of the prow of a ship, the Ledby ship from Denmark, a find from about 920 AD. There's also evidence of a similar horse or dragon-shaped head from Birka in Sweden. So maybe this is what this graffiti is actually representing, although it's, I think, a bit unclear. It has been suggested. And just west of Istanbul at Bathanea, near Lake Küçükçekmece. I'm going to ask Elif to help me pronounce that one. This is a proposed 9th to 11th century Viking settlement. They were excavated also this summer. And it's been identified as a possible Varangian settlement or Varangians being in this area because there's been finds of amber and finds of Viking cross and some metal with what's been called a Viking snake depicted on it. So this has also been suggested as a site. Maybe it's referred to in text, this site called Civitot, which is where some of the Vikings, the Varangian Guard, who lived outside of Constantinople lived. And also, if we think about further south almost on the Mediterranean coast or on the Mediterranean coast of Anatolia, at the site of Patara in one of a grave there, a Viking sword was found. This is what's preserved of it. The wood of the handle has disintegrated. You just see the metal part of it. But this has been proposed as being a Viking sword from the site, maybe dating to the 9th or 10th century. So when we talk about Vikings and we talk about interaction with Constantinople, we think about this, maybe this friend or foe type relationship, where the first groups who come down into Constantinople are the Rus, who are coming through the Russian river systems. And they first arrive through the Russian river systems, through the Black Sea, into the Bosphorus about 860. And it's not a friendly interaction. There's recorded attacks, a series of attacks, and a series of treaties between the Rus and the Byzantine emperors to try and stop these attacks in the early 10th century. By 944, there was at least an agreement that 50 Varangians or 50 Vikings could come into the city at one time through one gate. And they were allowed it was a bed and breakfast type arrangement. They were allowed lodging, free lodging and free meals and free baths. That was very important because they were considered very filthy. But there was still pillaging that took place at this time. So this was always a tenuous relationship. And it really went maybe a little bit better when in 988, Vladimir, who was the leader of the Rus from Kiev, he made a treaty and married Anna, the sister of the Emperor Basil. And this is really when the Rus converted or became Christian, and there's churches being built in Kiev. And also at this time, Vladimir sends 6,000 Vikings to help Emperor Basil. And these are what become the Varangians, the kind of hired hands, the mercenaries that are engaged in warfare throughout the Aegean and also Eastern and Western Mediterranean. There's an example here. It didn't go so well. This woman is killing a Varangian in this document. But the Varangians last until about 1341. So it's a period of mercenaries coming from the north and working for the employ of the Byzantine emperors. One of the most famous Varangian guards is Harald Hardrada, who was later the king of Norway. And he also tried to take the British Isles. He died, unfortunately, in the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 in England. So against William the Conqueror. So there's a broad relationship here between the Varangian Guards being some of the most, say, warrior-minded ideas we have about the Vikings' interaction with the Byzantine Empire. So all of these things we've talked about, or we've looked at, the material culture, the emergence of trade networks, Vikings abroad, how do we know that they got around? What is the means? What is the method of transportation? And if we think about the sources pointing towards ships as the main form of transportation through waterways, rivers, and across oceans, we look at iconography, so lots of illustrations from graffiti to manuscript illuminations. We have some information and texts about these ships, so we have rune stones that mention them, but we also have exterior sources like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Old English Orosius, and we have Icelandic sagas. So a very famous one is the one of Snorri Snorrason, talking about these long ships are like worms on waves across the North Atlantic. And then we have archaeological finds of ships, and this is really by far the largest group of finds that we have, or data to work with. And compared to earlier periods, we have a lot more finds in the Viking period. There's certain reasons for this. We can get into that maybe at the end, but I'll spend the rest of my talk discussing what the ships are like and some of their characteristics. So this is a reconstruction, but it gives us a pretty good idea of what to see, and we look at a Viking ship. These double-ended hulls, so the bow and the stern look very similar, with curved stems, and they had broad square sails made out of wool. We have also this clinker construction that's very unusual. So what that means is we have overlapping plank edges, which these edges are riveted together with iron nails and rows. So this is what we're looking at. This nail goes through one end of a plank, one edge of a plank, through the other edge of the plank below it, and it's locked with a row of a flat plate on the inside edge, and the nail is cut off. So these overlapping planks, they are joined with these rivets, and between these overlapping plank edges is used kind of a waterproof caulking of wool and tar that seals the planks together, so they're waterproof. And then we also have, after the bottom of the ship is built up, these very lovely frames. You see one here in the bottom left being fitted in at the bottom of the ship. They start to be added to the bottom of the ship to build it up and to build a system of what we call a transversal strengthening of the vessel itself, so across the width of the ship. And this is the three plans of three archaeological finds of ships. So if we cut the ship down its middle right at the mast, this is what we're looking at. And I've put this in here because I want us to get a sense of really how delicate Viking ships are in a way. The planks themselves are very thin. They're never more than 2 or 3 centimeters thick. They're extremely flexible, actually. But there's never an excess of wood. There's always just enough for the planks, the frame system, and these thwarts that go across the ship sides up, basically, where the rowers would sit when rowing the vessel. And the system, it's very lightweight, but it's also very flexible at the same time. And this interior framing across the ship adds this kind of transversal strength, but then we have these long elements of keels and then what we call wales, or a thick longitudinal strengther going down the side of the ship, which supports it in. So it's both directions across and lengthwise the ship is strengthened, but still flexible. And this is really important when you're sailing a ship out on the open sea, especially the North Atlantic. You want a ship to be rigid, yes, but you don't want it to be too rigid, because if it keeps hitting the waves again and again, and it can't absorb that shock, it's going to start breaking apart. And so there's a flexibility involved, and some of these reconstructions of long ships, one of them, it's here in Roskilde in Denmark, it's 30 meters long. You can stand at one end and shake the stem, and you can see the whole ship move. And that's ideal. You want it to move and flex when it's going up and down these strong, huge North Atlantic waves. These are some examples of the major archaeological finds of Viking ships we have from this period. There's 4 major ones here I've put, some Osebergs, we have Gokstel, Tuna ship, and Lerby, and these are all from Norway and Denmark. There's no major archaeological find of a Viking ship known from present-day Sweden yet. There might be, but so far it's only Norway and Denmark. And these are well known and well preserved because they were buried on purpose. They're part of these famous Viking burials. So they were, maybe their mast was removed, some elements were maybe removed, the sails aren't there anymore, but they were taken up out of the water. They were laid in a burial mound, so in the ground, deposited with grave goods, with the deceased, sometimes one, sometimes maybe 2 or 3 people, sometimes with their horses, sometimes with their dogs, and exotic items. From Oseberg, we have silk, which was part of the grave burial. And then over the ship, a mound of dirt is built up. And this is what's really preserved these finds of Viking ships. And for us, fortunately for archaeologists, what we get to work with today. An unusual find outside of these burial mounds comes from a site called Skudelev in Denmark, which is about 20 kilometers west of Copenhagen. And the Skudelev find is very unusual because it was 5 ships that were deposited within a relatively short period of time of each other, mid-11th century, towards the end of the 11th century. And they were deposited, they were cleaned, they were sunk in a small channel. So they were sunk with stones and held in place by wooden poles. And it was to block a navigational channel in Roskilde Fjord, because at that time Roskilde was the seat of the bishop and the seat of the king. And at that time there were some problems with Norway. There were many problems with Norway, and they were coming down through the North Sea and into the Roskilde area, and this was a way to try and prevent ships from getting to Roskilde itself. These ships are also very interesting because they were the first real maritime archaeological finds that were excavated, not just in Denmark, but really globally. And this is from the excavation in 1962. The excavation started in 1957 underwater, and they realized that instead of just 1 ship, there were actually, they thought originally 6, but then it went down to 5. And they decided in 1962 to excavate the site dry so that the water was shallow enough, only a few meters, that they were able to build a cofferdam and excavate the ship much quicker than by diving. And this is some of the photos from it. And a purpose-built museum was established in Roskilde at the bottom of the fjord in the late 1960s, and the ships were conserved, and then this is where they are displayed today. And these 6 ships are important because they not only represent different types of vessels. So we have 5 ships. We have a small cargo vessel, a large cargo vessel, a small little local patrol boat, a larger warship, and a small fishing vessel. And they're all from different places as well. We have 2 that were built in Norway. The study of the wood tells us that they were built in Norway. 1 was built in just outside of Dublin in Ireland, where the Vikings also were based. And 2 were built in Denmark. And they're different states of repair. One vessel was quite new when it sank, the large vessel from Norway, but a small vessel, patrol boat from Denmark, was actually built of secondhand pieces of wood from other ships. So it was a very clever shipwright who could take the trash and recycle it and build a usable patrol boat. And this is what makes these ships so unique in the history of Viking Age studies, is because they're very different. They're not the standard grave burial good warships that we had seen from the burial mounts. And at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, they've also built reconstructions of these ships in order to understand them a bit better and understand the building process, but also to try and understand how they were used and their sailing capabilities. And one of the major sources for studying these ships, or how to build them, is looking at iconography. And one of the main examples is actually the Bayou Tapestry. This is a wonderful source because it depicts the Norman conquest of England. So this is when William the Conqueror is preparing to go into the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And this is his fleet preparing to build ships to cross the English Channel. And we can see up in the north part of the screen here, we have these men are, let's move our little section here. We see them cutting down with a long axe. They're cutting down trees. They're planing the wood that they've cut down. They're using drills to make holes, possibly for these rivets. There's an adze there, planing the wood as well. So this is something that's a major source, because maybe we only have archaeologically the metal parts of the tools from archaeological finds. We don't have the wooden parts. This helps boat builders understand how these tools might have been used. And this is an example of the reconstruction process at Roskilde of using the, let's try and get this, of using these traditional tools. So not using power tools, not using any kind of mechanized step in the process, but using, as they would have done in the Viking Age, how do we build a ship? And it can be done, and it can be done, and it's not only that, it's 5 times, now 6 times they've built a 6th ship now, based on the Roskilde finds from Skudaleo, and have sailed these to Norway. Some have sailed in Greenland, some have sailed back to Ireland and back again as experimental archaeology. So through iconography and text and archaeological finds of ships, it becomes very clear that in Scandinavia, the sail was adopted relatively late. So compared to other places, compared to the Mediterranean, compared even to England, we know that during the Roman period, there was ships with sails in the North Sea. But why the sail was introduced relatively late to Scandinavia has been the subject of some debate. And again, for these iconography through text, through archaeological finds, well, you can try and get a sense of how the sail was adopted and when it was adopted. And the first evidence we really have of sails in Scandinavia is from the 7th century, these so-called picture stones from the island of Gotland in the middle of the Baltic depict ships with sails. So clearly these aren't maybe the first ships with sails, but how long they have been using sails is of course not known at this time from the archaeological material. We have a little bit more ancillary evidence. If we think about one of the first Viking attacks on the English coast at Lindisfarne in 793. This is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And although the Chronicle doesn't tell about the types of ships that the Vikings arrived in, it's thought that if you're going to cross the North Sea from Scandinavia, you probably want to do it with a sail. You don't want to row the entire way be exhausted by the time you arrive at the monastery and are ready to attack. So it's theorized, at least from, it's not positive evidence, it's ancillary evidence, that the Vikings probably were already sailing pretty much at this time. So the late 8th century here. The first most, I could say, clearest evidence, of course, is archaeological find of a ship with a mast. And this is from Oseberg in Norway from around 820 AD. And this is one of these beautiful burial graves from the just outside of Oslo. And this was a grave that had 2 women in it. Again, as I had mentioned, I think some silk, imported silk and other imported goods from around the trading routes of the Viking world. And this ship clearly has a mast, and basically from then on, from around 820, middle of the 9th century, all ships that are found within Scandinavia have a mast. So this is something that then seems to take off during this period. Why? This is a reconstruction of the same ship that sails very well. The question as to why sails were not adopted as early, for example, maybe in the Mediterranean. We've seen examples on the southern coast of Turkey, 1300 BC, Ullobron ship, although we don't have archaeological evidence. It probably was a sailing ship. From Khufu ship in Egypt, even earlier, 2000 BC, we have 2600 BC, we also have sails. So this is something that is widespread in the Mediterranean, but of course it comes very late in Scandinavia. And the theory has been that it takes a lot of energy to make a sail, when you think about it. And this is known through experimental archaeology. So on the right-hand side here, this is at the Viking Ship Museum. A woman here, Anna, is making a strip of a sail in wool, and she's using the exact same process as they would have done in the Viking Age. This is a reconstruction of a stand-up loom that was found in Greenland. And so we know it's accurate enough, and making this strip of wool. And it just to weave the wool to make this sail, which is 45 meters of wool, lengths of wool was used. It took her 2,000 hours just to weave the sail. And this is for a relatively small boat. You can see the size of the boat here. Maybe there's 5 or 6 people in it. So not a large Viking ship, which would have a sail of about 120 square meters, much larger. That's on top of the fact that you have to have the sheep. You have to have the sheep with the right type of wool. You can't use all the wool of the sheep. It's only a certain part of the wool, the inner part, that you can use. You have to maintain those sheep. And then you have to, after you shear the wool from the sheep, you have to, of course, weave the thread. This is a long, involved process. The theory is, as opposed to sails that were in the Mediterranean that were mainly made out of flax or hemp, or made out of even cotton, wool was a much more involved process. It wasn't a readily available resource. So maybe this is prohibitively expensive for navigators to use. The other idea is that perhaps the maritime environment didn't really call for sails at the time. If involved in contacts between groups inside of Scandinavia before the Viking Age, there's really a calm bodies of water, so people are moving between land and islands and rivers. But in the Baltic, you don't have tides, and you don't really have very much current. So, and the distances aren't so great. If you want to go to Sweden, I can see Sweden from my flat here in Copenhagen. You can almost see sometimes other parts of Denmark, and also from Sweden to Norway. So it's not a long distance, and these can be very easily traveled by paddling or rowing. But it's that expansion into the North Atlantic, into the North Sea, that you have these large waves, you have these large tides, tides of 3 meters. you have currents and strong winds, that it makes sense that you're going to start using a sail and start getting around by using a sailing ship. It makes no sense to paddle a row in these environments. It's just too difficult. So those are some things to think about when we think about technology and availability of resources, but also the maritime environment that ships operated in. So in closing, if we look at the characteristics of the Viking Age, I'd like to bring up 4 main points for us today. We have the establishment of major trading and craft centers and ports. These are, I gave the examples of the main ones of Birka, Kaupang, Ribe, and Helgo, all port settlements with extensions east and west, north and south. Point 2, we have exploration of sailing ships out from the Scandinavian homeland. Point 3, we have this discovery and settlement of new places in the North Atlantic. So the colonization of Iceland, of Greenland, and of Vinland. And point 4 is the long distance trade routes that existed in the North Atlantic, but also to the Mediterranean and the Middle East and Russia, through the river systems and the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, but also along the English Channel down into the Bay of Biscay and through the Strait of Gibraltar. There are some trade routes that were known. So at the end, I think it's difficult to separate Vikings from a relationship to the sea and the important role of ships within Viking history. How was this possible? How were these achievements technologically possible? We have, well, the development of the clinker ship construction, this extremely light yet flexible construction that can go across different bodies of water. And we also have the adoption of the sail coming at the right point in time. And these really equal a perfect situation or conditions for expansion, but also for trade locally and long distance. So this, of course, we combine it with economic, social, and political factors, really allowed for the Viking Age to flourish between the 8th and 11th centuries in Scandinavia, and for Vikings really to impact their shores, but also shores far beyond their own. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure there are questions. Maybe I will start with one, if that's okay. Well, I actually have 2.
Sure.
So the first one is there a preferable kind of wood? Did they choose certain kinds of wood over other kinds of wood? And the second one is, when they were traveling on the rivers, especially going into the Black Sea, were they using sails then, or is it much better to use the paddles or the rowing and all of that? I mean, probably in the earlier periods they weren't using them, as you said, the sails, but did this using sails on the rivers, did they make a difference, or did they even use them?
Yeah, okay, the first question is about wood, and this is something that because we have the archaeological finds, we know a lot about. There's mainly there's oak, but also linden and ash is used a lot. Beech is also used, but oak seems to be the primary structural component, you could say. But these long flexible planks can also be out of beech and ash. The river systems are really interesting because it's not much is known archaeologically. There's been some bits of boats found in Ukraine along the Dnieper and the Volga into northern Ukraine, and it's unsure if these are we can call Viking boats, or are they local, possibly Cossack vessels. And some of them seem to have a little bit of we call a mast step, which would hold the mast, but those can also be for a post for towing the vessel upriver against the current. So it's not known if these are actually mass. If you're going downriver, it makes sense to just follow the current. You don't have to sail. You'd save a lot of energy that way. But going upriver, maybe the wind is not ideal, so towing it upriver is more useful. Some of the issues are in these rivers as well is there's no portage places because of, just like on the Nile, for example, the cataracts, these kind of natural dams that stop the flow of water or limit the flow of water, that ships have to come out over land and be dragged and then put back in the river. There's no portage places along these rivers in Russia. And so you also have to think the ship is not that large because it has to be dragged over land, but also having, instead of a mast, having this post for towing it would also make sense there. So until there's a large body of archaeological evidence found at any of these sites in the Russian river systems, it's really based on textual evidence, trying to kind of extrapolate what's meant by some of these texts, and also piecemeal bits of boats that are found.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions here. I'll read them out. Charles is asking, were the Vikings a single ethnic group with a single language and with a unified state?
It seems language-wise that there was runes, for example, are relatively similar. There's runes known from the Scandinavian homeland, and also so present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And it seems that because of the colonization process, the language was also, the written language at least, was also transferred very easily. There's some graffitos known from Iceland and known from around Dublin and Ireland. But again, this is a written language. This might be very different from what the spoken language is, and that's not known, and that can never really be known how similar the spoken languages are. It's clear from some of the texts that people could understand each other. People from Norway could understand people from Denmark, and there was unified kingdoms of a sense, where we mentioned Harald Bluetooth, who Christianized the Danes. He for a time was king of Norway as well, although there became other successors after him that separated Norway from the kingdom of Denmark. So unification fluctuated in terms of political alliances. Norway, it seems, separated itself off into the Middle Ages, but then joined with Denmark again in the Middle Ages, and then Sweden and Denmark and Norway all joined again at the very end of the Viking Age into one political unit. And it seems that from those texts, beginning in the Middle Ages, where we have what was called the Kalmar Union, began in the 1400s, the three crown states of Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, that already the languages were kind of separating a little bit, and this becomes apparent. But even today, a Swede and Dane and a Norwegian can understand each other, and it's more of a sense of dialects than it is really of different languages. That being said, it's interesting that Icelandic is considered Viking Norwegian. It's almost like the first settlers to colonize Iceland were from Norway, and it's almost considered Viking Norwegian in its purest form. It hasn't really changed that much. Okay. I hope that answered your question about a political state and unification, and the answer is, the short answer is that it fluctuates quite a bit. If we talk about ethnic origins, that is up to a huge debate, where people are coming from. It seems that there are local groups, very local groups from different island to different island in Scandinavia, especially in Denmark, that consider themselves separate from the other groups that they're fighting with. So how one interprets one as a separate cultural group from another is also up to debate, and how you mean that question. But the Vikings were very not really too picky. We know from their raids is that when they were collecting slaves, for example, or on raids collecting goods and people, they also picked up women from different coastal areas and brought them, for example, to Iceland and to Greenland. It's known that some maybe willing or unwilling women from the British Isles were taken as well to help the colonization process. So it's a mix, and there's also I mentioned that woman from the burial with the Allah ring from Burqa. She was also buried with a number of coins that were minted in present-day Afghanistan. And unfortunately, there's not enough left of her bones to know if she was Scandinavian in origin or if she came from somewhere else. So the level of science is trying to catch up with studying these genetic pathways, you could say, or interactions between groups, which I think is a really interesting way forward when we start thinking about archaeological research and what it can answer. That has had its effect already in Denmark in the Bronze Age, because some of the traditional Bronze Age Danish finds, there's a very famous one here called the Egtved. It's a woman who was buried in a very wonderful woolen dress in an oak log boat in the late Bronze Age, so about 1200 BC. And she was always thought to be the ultimate example of what a Dane was. And they did some genetic studies on her and also some strontium analysis. So looking at her teeth and where she was taking water her whole life. And it found out that she was actually from southern Germany. And so this is also raises questions of mobility, how much people moved back and forth in history. I think will really amaze us when we start to get some scientific answers to this guesswork that we have right now for archaeology.
Well, related to that, there's a question from Phyllis Erdogan. What were their sources of slaves? Where did they take them to sell them? Did they sell them to individuals, or were they for the rulers?
Yeah, I don't think the Vikings, if we read some of the external texts, for example, there's a very famous one, a text by Ivan Fadlan from visiting the Rus in the river systems of the Eastern Baltic and Russia, and he talks about these very in graphic description about the Rus Vikings taking slaves and their slave raids, and so they didn't seem to be too picky. They could turn on neighbors as well, and it seems that there was local slave raids as well as long distance slave raids. For example, going to the British Islands and collecting slaves there and bringing them back, or again using them, as I mentioned, for colonization. It seems one of the main sources in Northern Europe, like I mentioned, the Slavs, so from basically the area in the southern Baltic, the Wends, this area between northeastern Germany and Poland, also was a major source of slaves, but also even further abroad. So whenever they're raiding or can take bounty and any kind of raid or attack, it seems it would be a fair game to do. So there's stories even of this happening in, there was a raid that had, I think it was about the late 900s that occurred in Seville. The Vikings had come down the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula, sailed up the Guadalquivir and attacked Seville and made themselves at home and took slaves and goods and went back to wherever they came from. We don't know where they exactly came from. The source is from the Idrisid period, so it's from the Caliphate at the time in the Iberian Peninsula. It's an external source, so we don't know if they were from, for example, Norman in that sense, that was the British Isles, or were they from Scandinavia themselves? So it's unclear of their origins, but they certainly made themselves open their options up to taking whatever they could, where they could.
Interesting. Okay, so here's another question. It's from Laura Lister, who actually has asked questions in two places. Did the ships have keels and rudders? How movable were the sails? And then she later asked, regarding the metals, where did they get tin to make the bronze?
Yeah, this is something that when you make bronze, it's a combination of copper and tin and certain levels. And one of the major sources for the tin is coming from, like it was in earlier periods, is from the British Isles. So Cornwall, still a known source, is a major source of it, but also it's coming in from, there are a few sporadic sources in the Iberian Peninsula, although not as widely utilized as the ones that are from Cornwall. So that's been thought to be the major source of tin, coming in with these major copper deposits that you find throughout Central Europe. So you had to, when you're, of course, making bronze, you have to think ahead, and it's not just something you dig up and melt down. You have to have two parts and in the right amount, and the proper smelting technique to make bronze. So this is a major advancement, but that's been thought to be one of the main sources, and still in Cornwall, as it has been for until historical periods.
Okay, so there's a question from Orhan Sardar. Did we have any data or findings from excavations about what kind of anchors the Viking ships were using?
Yeah, let me see if I can, I don't know with the image of, let me see here in my talk if I have, no, I thought I had the Bayou Tapestry image, but there's a lovely image in the Bayou Tapestry where you actually see the ship throwing an anchor, and it's a lovely iron anchor, mono piece basically, on a metal iron chain. And there's an archaeological find of one from the Ladby ship, which is dated to around 920 AD here in Denmark. It was, again, a burial. And so aside from numerous bones of horses that were slaughtered and dogs, next to the man who was buried in this burial mound, they also found a lovely preserved iron anchor. And that's one of the primary finds of known archaeological finds of anchors from the Viking period. There's a few bits and pieces of what are thought to be iron anchors from Norway, but none that have been really found in a verifiable context, like at the Ladby ship.
Okay, Laura is asking, what about the deep keels, rudders, and movable sails?
Yeah, the ships had deep keels. Yeah, they definitely did. And this is one of the things to think about with when we talk about deep keels. Of course, the size of the ship, it's comparable and exponential to the size of the ship. But you're right that they had deep keels in the sense that when you're sailing, for example, in a marine environment where you have a lot of waves and you want to be stable in those waves, you're going down the face and coming up the face of another wave, you want the keel to help you grab the water. And that's why you want it deep enough. So from the shape of your hull, let's say this is the bottom of your hull, you want the keel to extend below that. That it kind of helps you move forward in the water when you're sailing. This is something comparable. I'm trying to think, the long ship that was built in Roskilde. So this is about 30-meter long ship, a galley, a rowing galley. So there was 30 rowers on each side. I think the keel actually projected about 15 or 20 centimeters below the shape of the hull. At the same time, a lot of these ships also went into shallower waters. So having a deep keel is not so ideal. So there was a kind of a fine balance between having a deep keel for the open ocean, but still being able to have a ship that had a shallow enough keel help you in smaller waterways. Aside from that, a lot of boats were actually dragged up on beaches. And this happens here still today in Scandinavia. In the winter months, ships are dragged up on shore, so they can winter outside of frozen waters, basically. So you don't need you don't want a ship with a very deep keel, because it makes it very difficult to drag it out, and also can be detrimental to the ship on starting to weight itself down on its side. So it's kind of a fine balance, which they were able to really achieve amazingly, because these sea trials that they've done with reconstructions of Viking ships show that they really are extremely effective in North Atlantic seas, the North Sea, for example. They can handle the waves, but they can also still be dragged up on beaches.
Okay, we have a question from Ege Kunuk. Beside places like Dorstad in Frisia, could the Vikings get established down in the Rhineland? Are there anything remaining from them? Did they actively trade or just raid in the region?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Dorstad is in Frisia, so and we have these kind of borderlands between Belgium and Holland today, and that's actually one of the first trading partners the Vikings had. I didn't talk about them with a focus on the East and North Atlantic, but this was one of the first trading partners. And the settlement I mentioned, Ribe in Western Denmark and Western Jutland in Denmark, was basically one of the major, say, Western ports established to facilitate this trade with the Frisians. And one of the things they were really trading was these kind of very special quern stones, which were used for milling, that would come from the region. They were very sought after and traded. And also there's large barrels of fish. Herring was a huge product that was traded back and forth as well. And it seems that what was traded down into Dorstad in this region, and of course in areas of the northern Rhineland, was deer antler coming from northern Norway. They've done a lot of genetic studies with DNA of combs, for example, or decorations of artifacts been found in the Rhineland and in Frisia that show that they were from northern Norway. They come from deer antlers that were from northern Norway. So they know this, at least this was kind of a trade. If they were coming down from Norway, being traded into Ribe, maybe being made into combs and small decorations there, and then being traded into Frisia is a possibility. So yeah, this is definitely an area. There were some raids, but it was mainly a trading relationship. It seemed to be when there were some economic problems. Of course, there could be some engagements, but it seemed to be a relatively peaceful relationship between the Frisians for the most part and the Vikings. And of course, as the Vikings moved down into Normandy, this area also became a little bit more Viking as well.
Are there any other questions? Anybody? You can ask them. I mean, you can mute yourself, ask if you like, but if not, well, if not, I would like to very much thank you, Athena. This was very interesting, very fascinating. We know, I mean, I personally know very little about all of this, and I'm very, very fascinated. I want to learn more about all this area and all these people. Just one last question, and then I will let you go.
Sure.
Do we have any Viking finds that you know of in Jennikappe? Did they find anything that they could attribute to a Viking presence? Or do we know anything? I mean, maybe it's not all entirely studied.
That's a really good question. I mean, I've only really tried to become familiar with the ship finds. There's 37 of them, so they're slowly publishing them. But that's a good question. I haven't seen anything. I'm trying to think. There was that exhibit at the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul.
But it was a very tiny part of the material.
Right.
I know it's not properly studied, all of it. So
that'll be very interesting to watch what comes out of those publications, because that you would expect, that's the right time period, and you'd expect to see some of the upper levels really having some material, especially the ships. And we have the texts that talk about the Vikings and their own sagas coming to and sailing into the Golden Horn and things like this. So you expect that you find Viking material in a harbor if they're coming to that area. So that's something that actually, that's a good idea to really think if there's any clear material culture that can be attributed to Vikings, yeah, from Yanakapa. That would be, yeah, something to watch out for.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you very much. And I really, really hope very soon we'll see you in person in Istanbul
so
and in Ankara, elsewhere, or all of them. So
yes, great. Thanks for the opportunity, and it was very nice seeing everyone, and thank you for following along. So good night from Copenhagen.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Let's go to Norway.